They were both lovely, both intelligent and clever, both irresistible. Their claims to the throne were so equal that it was impossible to prefer one to the other. One of these fairies was Fairy Flight, and the other Fairy Constance. Under the circumstances, it was unanimously decided that whichever of the two fairies could show to the world the greatest wonder, that fairy should become the head of fairyland. But it was to be a special kind of wonder. No moving of mountains or any other common fairy trick would do. Fairy Flight decided that she would bring up a prince who would charm one woman after another but stay true to no woman. Fairy Constance decided to bring up a princess who was so enchanting that no man could meet her without falling in love. If Fairy Flight's changeable prince could resist the charms of Fairy Constance's princess, then Fairy Flight would win and become head of fairyland. Yet, if Fairy Constance's princess could win the heart of the prince and gain his proposal of marriage, then Fairy Constance would become head of fairyland. Fairy Constance decided to bring up a princess who was so enchanting that no man could meet her without falling in love. Fairy Constance began at once, and she did not lack a candidate for her design. Yet she had to wait long before the time came for her plan to begin unfolding. Fairy Flight, however, could not endure the thought of having to wait, and she began hatching a scheme. After she had carefully scanned the horizon, she lighted upon a handsome young prince named Millefleur, who was celebrated throughout the realm for his fascinating manners. Fairy Flight was all the more pleased with her choice because, thanks to his father's friendship with the king, the young prince often visited the court of the king where lived the 12 princesses that Fairy Constance had taken care of. To tell the truth, when Fairy Flight first made her choice, she did not know but that the prince's heart would prove resistant to the charms of Fairy Constance's future princess. But she counted on the fact that if this should prove to be the case, the prince would, at the very least, be unable to resist the wiles of the 12 princesses. Fairy Flight knew her powers well, and the art of changing men's hearts at will was one of her specialties. It was therefore with a light heart that she went to see the king and told him of her intention. The king believed in Fairy Flight's power and promised to assist her in every way possible. For his part, the prince was very eager to please his dear father, and so he accepted the invitation to come and dine at the palace, hoping to get a chance to admire the 12 princesses. Fairy Constance watched all this with a smile. She, too, had plans. No sooner had Fairy Flight declared war than Fairy Constance had donned her battle armor. Her magical staff was firm in her hand. Her heart beat bravely against her ribs. The hour of the contest was drawing near, and she was ready for it. Meanwhile, Fairy Flight brought up the prince as brilliantly as she could. She lavished on him all her skill, and her efforts were crowned with success. As he grew up, Prince Millefleur won the admiration of everyone around him. In fact, there was no one who could resist the magic of Fairy Flight, which had invested him with an irresistible charm. The prince's father wrote to him again and again, commanding him to return home, and proposing for him one better match than the next, yet all in vain. Nothing in the world could tear the prince from the 12 objects of his affections. But Fairy Constance cast a glance at the beautiful prince, and her lips curved into a smile. Now the battle was joined. What Fairy Flight needed was to keep the prince's heart free and easy. On the other hand, Fairy Constance needed him to fall in love and marry. Fairy Constance understood well that if the prince had not loved at least one of the 12 princesses, she would lose the battle. One day, the court of the 12 princesses gave a large royal garden party. Just as the guests were all assembled, and Prince Malafla, as usual, was dividing his attentions between the 12 beauties, a distant humming of bees was heard. As the humming became louder, the ladies of the court, fearing their stings, uttered little shrieks and fled. Immediately, to the horror of all who were looking on, the bees suddenly grew to enormous size, then each one chased a princess, finally pounding on her and carrying her off into the air. In an instant, all 12 princesses had disappeared into the sky. This amazing occurrence plunged the whole court into the most terrible grief. It was bad enough that the baby Rosanella had vanished so mysteriously years before from her royal cradle, but now this, that all 12 princesses would be carried off by giant bees. Prince Malafla cast about in a violent rage, then gradually fell into such a deep state of depression it was feared that if nothing could rouse him, that he would surely die. His protector, Fairy Flight, rushed to his side, but he rejected with scorn all the portraits of lovely princesses which she offered him to replace his lost beauties. In short, it was evident that he was in a bad way, and Fairy Flight was at her wits' end. One day, as the prince wandered about absorbed in his sorrow, he heard sudden shouts. Through the air, a chariot of crystal, glittering in the sunshine, was slowly approaching. 6 lovely maidens with shining wings drew it by rose-colored ribbons, while a whole flight of others, equally beautiful, were holding long garlands of roses crossed above it so as to form a complete canopy. Inside the chariot sat the Fairy Constance. By her side, a princess whose radiance positively dazzled all who saw her. As the chariot landed, they proceeded to the Queen's apartments. Exclamations of wonder rose on all sides at the loveliness of the strange princess, and the marvel of its arrival, and the crowd so thickened that it was quite difficult to make a way through. "Great Queen," said Fairy Constance, "permit me to restore to you your daughter Rosanella, whom I stole years ago from her cradle." Words cannot express how surprised and delighted the Queen was to be reunited with her long-lost baby. But after a while the Queen said to Fairy Constance, "But my 12 lovely ones, do you know if they are lost to me forever? Shall I never see them again?" Fairy Constance only said, "Very soon you will no longer miss them," in a tone that evidently meant, "Don't ask me any more questions." Mounting again into her chariot, she swiftly disappeared into the sky. The news of the return of the long-lost Princess Rosanella was soon carried to the prince, but he had hardly the heart to go and see her. He so missed his 12 lost loves. However, it became absolutely necessary that he should at least pay his respects. He had scarcely been 5 minutes in the presence of Rosanella before it seemed to the prince that she combined in her own charming person all the gifts and graces which had so attracted him in the 12 princesses whose loss he had so truly mourned. And after all, it is really easier to be with one person at a time. Almost before he knew it himself, he was begging the lovely Rosanella to marry him. The moment the words left his lips, Fairy Constance reappeared, this time smiling and triumphant in the chariot of the head of Fairyland. The heart of the faithless Prince Millefleur had been conquered, and he wanted nothing less than to stay by